The following lesson is linked to Learning Outcome 2, Reading and Viewing. It addresses the assessment standard that focuses on poetry and requires learners to recognize how word choices, imagery and sound devices affect mood, meaning and theme. It also recognizes that verse and stanza forms, rhyme, rhythm and punctuation affect meaning. From the bard of long ago to today's rhyming rapper, oral poetry is a celebration of the spoken word in one of its highest forms. Today we are looking at one of the oldest art forms, that of oral poetry. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to examine the content, poetic devices and presentation of poems, and identify different kinds of oral poetry. In the first lesson in this series, we learned that oral poetry is poetry which is recited to an audience. But what is poetry? In his poetry compilation, Poetry Works, Robin Malan describes poetry as the organizing of an experience into patterns of sound which will communicate that experience truthfully. This definition places emphasis on poetry as patterns of sound and explains that poems really come alive when someone speaks them. But how does the poet create these patterns of sound? A pattern is made when something is repeated. These sound patterns create rhythm. Rhythm is made by the beat in the poem, the stressed and unstressed words in arrangement together. Rhythm in spoken poetry is often very noticeable. A young South African poet called Conrad Feldman says this about rhythm.
Rhythm in poetry I would define as the flow, or the speed of the flow of the actual poem.
The rhythm of the words used in a poem and the way that they are put together can be emphasized by a musical instrument or by someone clapping, clicking or stamping. A drummer who accompanies poets had this to say.
As a drummist or a percussionist, a rhythm for me is the music in the poem. As percussionists, we get the rhythm from the first stanza that the poet utters, and then we just flow with the poet.
We've already seen Zweli Themba Twalo reciting his poem. Now listen to the words of the poem and the sound patterns that are created.
The fact of the matter, the battle is getting hotter. In the gutter without glitter, the squatter can't live without water. I utter this chatter to the operator of the computer. One Mr. Hater and Miss Flater who get fatter and flatter. You better scatter.
The rhythm of the poem was easy to recognize. What helped to create the rhythm was the repetition of the t sounds in words such as bitter, better, fatter, scatter, and of course, water. This device is known as consonance and it involves repeating consonants in different parts of the words but not at the beginning of the words. When we listen to this poem, we are also struck by the poet's constant use of rhyme. For example, life rhymes with strife and education rhymes with starvation. Sometimes the syllable at the end of some lines sound the same, like the examples that we've just seen. And sometimes internal rhyme is created by using words within the same line that end with similar sounding syllables. Here's an example.
The Mr. Hater and Miss Traitor who get fatter and flatter.
Here hater rhymes with traitor and fatter rhymes with flatter within the two lines. Rhyme plays an important role in creating rhythm in a poem, but does poetry have to rhyme? Well-known local poet Lebogang Mashile shares her views on these aspects of poetry.
For me, I have been deeply influenced by music, hip-hop in particular. So rhyme is a common tool that I use, you know, because it makes the words sound more interesting. It makes the meaning more accessible to an audience, you know. It makes it more interesting to read on the page, yeah.
In addition to creating rhythm, poets also use figures of speech. The ones that would be of special use to the oral poet are those that are based on sound. We've already heard the use of consonants, but listen to this poem written by an anonymous poet and see if you can spot any other figures of speech that create interesting effects using sound.
Daily jail, confined in my cramped corner, amid the rumble of rumor, no humor pierces this poor prison. That loom of the room mercilessly crushes. My hopelessness slowly melts, seeps, drips through my consciousness. The teacher's droning is shattered. Tring goes the bell. My mind is let loose, out of school at last.
Most learners know how this person feels, as we have all longed to get out of school. But how does she emphasize her meaning? In a line like pierces this poor prison, you'll notice the P sound is repeated at the beginning of the word. The figure of speech that is used here is known as alliteration. Alliteration involves repeating the same consonant sound at the beginning of a number of words. In this poem, the alliteration helps the poet to put across her bitterness. In the next stanza, the poet has also used assonance when she talks of the gloom of the room. Assonance involves repeating similar, sounding vowel sounds close to one another. In the line we have just seen, the repeated oo sound helps to create a depressed mood. Another figure of speech that works well in oral poetry is known as onomatopoeia. This involves using words whose sounds seem to resemble the sounds they described. Have a look at the final stanza of the poem and see if you can find examples of onomatopoeia. Tring definitely sounds like the sound a ringing bell makes, and droning does make us think of the sound a teacher makes when she goes on and on about something. By contrast, shattered is a word that sounds like something being broken, which is exactly what happens when the teacher's lesson is broken by the bell. The use of onomatopoeia in that stanza helps us to imagine the scene, as some of the words used make it easy for us to imagine the sounds they refer to. The poem about water and the poem entitled Daily Jail that we have just listened to have rhythm and use figures of speech. However, poets need to do more than just choose words that create interesting sound effects. The poet, Arufa Khan, explains how he chooses words for his poems.
The way I write is, I do not write for lazy minds. So I always try to find words that have a lot more meaning than how you would normally use them. So a word that would have 2 or 3 meanings, because then it allows me to play around with adding different meanings to the poem. So it's literally like a craft where you sit and look for the best word possible to say a full sentence when you can say it in just 1 or 2 words. So through editing and refining the message you're trying to carve into your poem, then you sit and go through a thesaurus or even a dictionary just to help you find better words, because a simple word like walk, there's other words like stride, there's other words like float, it just depends on how you use it. And also using words to add meaning to your poem, using words to add rhythm to a poem. If I can give you one line that says, rolling thunders that scorn and scar a summer sky. So you use sort of assonance and alliteration to give rhythm to the poem, to give color also to the poem, and through sound, you can get color, you can get pictures of the setting, and understand the picture better.
The aspects of poetry that you have discussed so far, rhythm and rhyme, figures of speech and word choice, apply to both written and oral poetry. However, oral poetry also requires that poets think about the techniques of oral performance, which we explored in a previous lesson. Well, here they are again. Effective oral performers vary the volume, pitch, and pace which they speak. They speak clearly. They use facial expressions, gestures, and sometimes movements around the performance space. Build a relationship with the audience through eye contact. Think back to Zweli Tembatwalo reciting his poem about water and decide whether he performed well according to this list of criteria.
The fact of the matter, the battle is getting hotter. In the gutter without glitter, the squatter can't live without water. I utter this chatter to the operator of the computer. One Mr. Hater and Miss Traitor who get fatter and flatter. You better scatter.
Well, we have just seen an example of a poet performing a poem. However, this is only one form of oral poetry. Ballads that tell a story, sonnets, dramatic monologues, or lyrics can also be presented orally. Spoken poetry does not have to be limited to the sort of poems that you study at school. Lebogang Mashile feels strongly about this.
I think one of the saddest misconceptions about poetry is the fact that, it's this thing, this white European thing, these old dead white men in the pages of dusty books. And I understand where it comes from. It comes from the way that we were taught poetry. It comes from the kind of poetry that we were taught, We weren't taught things that were relevant to us, to our lives. And the reality is that poetry has always been an essential part of our culture, as African people. It's the way in which our values, our philosophy, our identity, our stories are told and are passed on, And the beautiful thing about poetry, for me right now as a poet, is its accessibility. All you need is a pen or a pencil and a piece of paper and somebody who's willing to listen to you. You don't need money, you don't need fancy resources, you don't need fancy equipment. All you really need is just the willingness to express yourself and the affirmation that comes with being listened to. And there's no price tag that you can put on the beauty, of that experience.
You may think you have never seen poetry being performed, but I'm sure you're familiar with local and international rap artists. Think about rap as a style of expression. Do you think rap is a form of oral poetry? Why? Well, rap consists of saying rhyming lines against an electronic beat in the background. It can be regarded as poetry because it contains many elements of poetry. Rappers use rhyme and rhythm. In fact, some people claim that rap stands for rhythm and poetry. As in other forms of poetry, rappers also talk about things that have happened to them, their relationships, and how they feel about all these matters. To get these messages across, they may also use figures of speech. If you are keen to try some performance poetry of your own, but you aren't keen to rap, another modern form of oral poetry is slam poetry. This type of poetry is composed to be performed to an audience as part of a competition. Most poetry recited at poetry slams is original, and the audience is called upon to judge the poem and the presentation. To do this, they hold up cards on which are written the scores that they have awarded to a performance. Slam poetry started in America, but it is starting to catch on in South Africa as a way of getting people to listen to and compose their own poetry. South Africa is home to many oral poets, and poetry slam events may lead to the discovery of even more talented poets. Why not ask your teacher if you can hold a poetry slam in class? Who knows, you may just be South Africa's next famous oral poet. To try out your oral poetry skills, here's today's task. Write a short poem of between 5 and 10 lines that creates rhythm and uses some of the figures of speech we have learnt about in this lesson. To do this, you may want to think about an experience that you have had that you would like to share with others. It could be something that happened, or it could be a special relationship that you were involved in. Once you have written your poem, practice saying the poem out loud. Perform the poem for other members of your class. That's it for today. Be sure to watch out for the next lesson in this series, where we will look at storytelling in more detail. See you then.